no presentation in crypto has ever been started without a good Doge meme. So just a recap on what all of this nonsense is ERC20s, you have your normal fungible tokens. We're all pretty used to these by now. There's more general tokens, and you have your ERC 721s, your NFTs, and how that's going to play into bonding curves a bit later is through a concept called refungibles. So that's when you take a non-fungible asset and you make a market the owner of it. So that way you can split ownership of the NFT up using a fungible token. There's a lot of interesting things when it comes to tokens that bonding curves provide a solve to, which is things like speculation, but we'll get onto that a bit in the next slides. So bonding curves, what exactly are they? So for the technical guys in the audience, basically it's a normal ERC20 token that has a dynamically set pricing.
Also,
they're often referred to as automated market makers in that they remove speculation, or at least arbitrary speculation. So the token supply, you can then actually design into the algorithm that early adopters can buy at a specific price, and that after it's gained a bit more traction, that the price will go up to at a specific point. You can only sell at what the market dictates. To buy the tokens, that it will just grow based on the curve rather than the volumes that are of attention that it might be receiving arbitrarily. So just to bring it back, bonding curves let you have these early adopter incentives. If you, for example, had a company that's doing an ICO, you could actually have the bonding curve set to a very low level at the beginning, just for all your initial investors buying the tokens in at a very flat rate, and then as more people buy, you could then have the price increase after a certain point of supply. The other thing is, since you can plot the price in a more controlled way, it also acts as an attention signal. So now you have these curves and markets that have a direct representation of the actual traction they might be getting and the amount of volume of collateral is but don't have to worry about that. So the most important fundamental thing is that it's pretty much just an ERC20, just with a dynamic pricing mechanism. So I'm going to hand over to Ben for a bit, and we're just going to talk basically about how bonding curves came into being, how this was sort of more business test cases, and what popularized bonding curves was a thing called curation markets, as written by Simon de Riviere from sunny South Africa. So Ben, I'll hand it to you.
Cool, thanks Ryan. Yeah, so curation markets is an idea or concept that has bonding curves as a sort of core engineering function. So they don't entirely rely on bonding curves, but it does provide certain features that we look for. So the curation markets, curation is defined in markets defined by Simon is to curate and collaborate around shared goals. So if you've got a community or you've got a project, certain goals, certain items that you might want to value in a market. The curation market allows you to create an autonomous market as well that is based on a smart contract, and you can also create tokenized incentive models around that market. So going on to the next slide. So it's a very basic mathematical function, or it can be. It's basically a curve with price on the y-axis and supply along the x-axis. And something to basically, as you mint tokens along the supply, your price there is no time, there is no sort of idea of time in this specific graph. So when you would sell tokens back along the supply, the price would decrease once again. And there are quite a few design parameters that you can look at when creating these curves. And if you go back to the idea of traditional economics, there's certain things that bonding curves allow you, specific features that bonding curves allow you to design around. And one of those is liquidity. So in a traditional market, if you want to, say, trade a share in a company, you would say, I want to buy 10 shares at $10. Someone else would be selling 10 shares at $10 and the trade would go through, you have liquidity. And that relies on there being buyers and sellers in this market. In this case of a bonding curve, when you buy along the curve, you are creating something called a collateral pool. And this collateral pool is a market maker and that it creates liquidity. So you could say, I want to buy into a specific bonding curve in a market. You would buy 10 tokens, and the curve would dictate how much those 10 tokens would cost. The amount that you've staked into this bonding curve is then stored in a smart contract, ready for the next person who decides they want to sell down the curve, and they would be given back that collateral out of the pool. So it creates liquidity in sort of smaller markets where you don't necessarily have the volume of people interested in this market to create that liquidity. And it also reduces risk. So by having that collateral pool, you're guaranteeing that when people sell out of the curve, they will be able to get back their collateral. So if we look at these design parameters here, there are about 6 design parameters. Issuance, which is what Ryan has already talked about. That's basically what token you want to use as the issued token in the bonding curve. The supply, so you can say, okay, I want to have a maximum token supply of 100 million. You could have an infinite token supply. Vesting, it's the same in sort of traditional economics, where you could say when people buy 10 tokens, they will have to wait a certain time period before they're allowed to extract those tokens back out of the market. And there are various reasons, if you look at later in the examples, for why you would choose to have, say, an infinite supply versus a capped supply of 100 million tokens. The other core design parameter is collateral. I'm sure everyone's heard of MakerDAO and their DAI token. And that is basically a token that has a lot more stability than sort of traditional crypto tokens, in that through some complex financial mathematics, they managed to tie the value of one DAI to $1. So if you have a project where you don't want if people buy into a bonding curve for 10 tokens, and they later sell out to get back their collateral, you don't want that to reduce in value. So you could use something like DAI as the collateral. And then you've also got to decide what your objective. So that objective comes from the problem. So in a specific project, you might have the problem of wanting to measure the value of a cryptokitty, or maybe you want to measure reputation. There are lots of abstract concepts that measure as well, but let's take a simple example for me, which we'll look at a bit more in depth later. But in the case of a meme, your objective is to try and find it's a price finding mechanism. So if people start buying along the funding curve, they buy 10 tokens, another 10 tokens, and continue on, and the market eventually will decide they are no longer willing to pay the price for a share in a specific meme. And in that way, it's a price finding mechanism. You reach a point of equilibrium. You can also decide on the function. We've shown you some linear curves. It doesn't have to be a linear curve, it can be exponential. It just has to be a positive curve. So as your supply increases, your price has to increase. And the pricing, the function, yeah, in the examples later, you'll see that we could have something a bit complex in the linear curve. Maybe you want the market to eventually flatten out. So at the beginning, you want a steep curve, quickly increasing price, but as the market matures, you want to have the value of the token stabilized. That could be something we decide. Pricing, you don't have to have the same curve for selling and buying. If you sell into the curve, if you buy into a bonding curve at a certain price and decide that the price that you want to sell out at is, say, 10% lower, what that essentially does is creates sort of taxation. So if people bought in and straight away sold out again, they would be losing value. But if they bought in, waited a certain time period until the token supply was further along the curve, and then sold out, then you would gain value. So it acts as both a way to reduce market manipulation as well as a way to provide some funding for the specific project. So yeah, so here's some potential use cases. I think we've got some examples coming up as well after this. So attention markets, as Ryan mentioned earlier, if you have a lot of this sort of small market that you've created in around your project using the curation market and bonding curve, you are essentially measuring the attention in a specific item, whatever you've decided to attach to the bonding curve, whether that's a CryptoKitty or a meme, you are measuring attention in that item by issuing tokens, seeing them have a market. And staged funding can also come into it, as we saw earlier with the sort of dynamic curves where you've got some sort of taxation, different buying and selling curves. You can also look at commitment. If a person buys one token at the very beginning of the bonding curve, and later on, when the token supply is 1,000, they sell out, they would make profits. And you are incentivizing people to commit to a community or commit to a project by doing that. And you can also measure their commitment by how much that token that they initially bought has grown in value. You can also look at utility or resource management. So if you look at something like the electricity supply in South Africa, for instance, you've got people paying all the same price for their electricity, yet some people don't have access to that electricity. So you could put the price of electricity into a bonding curve, you could buy tokens. Yeah, we'll move on from that example. Cool. So convergence is an interesting project which recently was, or at least I think in the next few weeks is going to go onto mainnet, right? So they are an open source personal economy platform. So they looked at the idea that artists, musicians, people contributing any sort of artistic value, you as a fan of that artist, would not have any direct way to invest in their success. If you've got a musician at an early stage who doesn't have a contract for performing at big venues with big crowds, there's no real way for you to invest in that artist, hoping that they would succeed and you would get a stake in that success. So I think if you go to slide 2, next one. So their problem statement was that creators need income, so that's musicians or artists. Contributors, fans, lack incentives to contribute to their work, and they have no exposure to creator upside. So if you go and see a movie because you really like the actor in that movie, you're not exposed to success. And also intermediaries have control, which means there's censorship, whether that's on YouTube, where YouTubers are kicked off, I don't know how often, but there are a number of cases of popular YouTubers being kicked off, and their fans have no say in that. And their solution, Convergent's solution, is to have creators launch their own crypto-economic tokens. So you'll see in the next slide how this would work. So essentially, if you, say, bought a movie ticket or bought a CD of a popular artist, you would be buying into their own sort of microeconomy of their success. So the more people that are interested in that artist buying into this artist's work, the more. So you can see here they have a spread. So that means a different buying and different selling curve, where there's some sort of taxation. So by buying into their idea or their work, you are providing a funding source for them. They would receive that tax. And at the same time, if you bought it early, you would also receive the upside of that funding curve increasing in price with the token supply. And yeah, so as the creator becomes more popular, people buy tokens called the price increase, and early contributors sell for positive return. So this is the example we looked at earlier with the design parameters. So Meme Lords was the product of a hackathon, and was one of the root ideas where curation markets started being thought about. People looked at this and saw a lot of value in it. It's a very basic idea. Essentially, got a whole bunch of memes. These memes get posted. They each have their individual bonding codes attached to them. And the value of that meme is defined based on its popularity. So we've played around with it at work a lot as an introduction to bonding curves and curation markets. And if you bought into a meme early on and it became popular, you would get a whole bunch of testnet Rinky ETH. And yeah, so it's a basic example of bonding. And you could then sell out and receive back the increased value. So at Linum Labs, we've also been part of working on a project called Molecule, which has recently been announced public. And from the article, Paul, the founder of Molecule, says that curation markets enable Molecule to harvest the best ideas in the open market. So this idea of harvesting ideas, we talked about it earlier, where we define what curation is. Curation being the selection, organization, presentation of information. And in the pharmaceutical industry today, we see that drugs are the research and development, the production of pharmaceutical drugs are often what drugs get you. That's the basic idea, and usually it's the drugs that make the most profit. And that doesn't always result in the best drugs being brought to markets. We've got lots of examples in the US of people's addiction to opioids and other drugs that were produced by big monopolies like Pfizer, or not going to put names out there, big pharmaceutical monopolies, and mostly driven by profits. If you've got a drug that is addictive, its users will keep buying that drug, and it might maybe cure their disease, but if they are hooked on the drug, that's going to make more profit than the drug that maybe cures the disease, but makes the users of that drug not reliant on it after a while. So back to curation markets. Basically, the problem is that these markets are expensive, slow, and risky. You end up with research being locked up and IP being locked up in these monopoly companies. And there's very little collaboration because of it. So it takes 20 years to produce a drug, let's say, and after that 20 years, you've actually got a very small chance of that drug being brought to market. It could fail. So it's very risky for the company. And because of that, they hold on to the IP, they hold on to the research, and there's no collaboration. So what curation markets and bonding curves will be a very small part of, but it's a good example of how the curation markets apply, is that they enable you to open up these markets with collaboration and also distribute ownership, risk, and returns among different parties, whether that's the R&D houses or the smaller pharmaceutical companies. And so what curation markets introduce is the ability to have smaller scale markets. So you might not necessarily have large volume of people interested in a specific drug and interested in its success, but curation markets introduce enough liquidity that you could have a small market of 100 people or 100 companies interested, being able to stake into the bonding curve for a specific drug. And it enables price discovery, which is a big problem in the pharmaceutical industry. You've got a lot of people, big financial institutions or pharmaceutical companies who try and figure out how to price a drug. And you've got a lot of drugs at the moment where the price is not fair. It's determined. It's not even determined by the price of R&D. So curation markets, by opening up the markets to more than just the monopoly pharmaceutical company you initially own that IP, you have more distributed input to what the price of the drug should be. And it also provides a funding mechanism. A lot of small R&D houses, let's say in Cape Town, South Africa, we don't have any big pharmaceutical companies here. So they are forced to build their IP to a larger company. By using curation markets and bonding curves in certain ways, you can provide another way to fund these drugs. Cool. I'm going to hand over to Ryan to talk about a pet project of his and Linum Labs, and then it's Proto.
Cool. So as less chill as I can, but Proto is an interesting concept when thinking about curation markets and bonding curves, in that it's trying to use bonding curves to represent intangible value. So when you have communities, much like it's Meetup, there's a value in people coming together for this purpose. But traditionally, that value is hearsay. It's something you just hope they believe you. They believe you when you say it's valuable. How do you quantify the value of a community? Now, if a community is the amount of effort, attention, or drive towards a common goal, then if you could tokenize that attention or that effort, then you have a stable metric that you can actually now use to represent this intangible value. So how Proto began is that we had this exact problem. We were trying to prove the value of some communities that we started with on Meetup and trying to get trying to get sponsors. They don't really believe in these little crypto meetups, well, at the time. So if you could actually represent that, then it's provable. You can say, here's the attention metric, it's provable by math. So Protea basically uses these bonding curves as the initial token of each community, but you don't have a very complicated bonding curve. It's not like a complicated sigmoid function that it goes up or down or sine waves or anything. For the most part, your average community grows quite slowly. So it's what we're testing with is a linear curve. So people join in a community, they buy at a certain price rate, and then maybe a year from now, one token is worth maybe 1.5% more or whatever. Because it's based on a community and not a business or product, the slant and growth rate of the bonding curve is vastly different to something you would use for, say, a startup. The other interesting thing is that, as Ben mentioned earlier, is when you have a bonding curve, you're trying to alleviate risk and speculation and stuff like that, you can't really, if the underlying collateral is itself unstable. So if you had a bonding curve that's backed by, say, ETH, for example, the price of ETH can go up and down. So now the people who have bought tokens with the bonding curve have this expectation of being able to sell it at a specific value. But then as the backing collateral drops, suddenly all those expectations are left unfulfilled. So we, as Ben mentioned earlier, use a thing called make a valve die. And they use over-collateralized debt positions, CDPs, to just maintain a price point. So they're using complex finance stuff just to make sure that the value is paid at a specific point. It's not necessarily tied to the dollar that's just aimed at it. But now what's cool is you have these tokens remain the same value. And now for onboarding users who might not be crypto, having a stable value point removes a lot of the sort of anxiety and the fear of having to enter into this kind of market. So just to speak to some projects out there that are using it, you have Relevant, which is run by the glorious basically what Relevant does is they're using commitment curves, attention metrics from bonding curves to curate content. And I do recommend any of their articles. They have a wonderful repo that has bonding curve examples. The links are in this slide. Clover's very interesting project. It's basically an array of dots that are randomized art pieces, and say these randomized dots appear as a alien or a hat or maybe a puppy, who knows. You could then buy into that as an NFT and then sell it out to a market, much like Nicolas works. Then there's molecule, converted Protea, we already discussed those. But yeah, so diving into the nitty-gritty, if you're familiar with the ERC20s, then there's the approve, the transfer from, market cap, those sort of things. Fundamentally, the only difference is these values you see here. So at the top, we have the gradient, and that just specifies. The example we're using here is just a linear curve, so just a straight line. So we have the gradient set there, the curve integral that just works out the current volume of the curve, and then you have a price to mint and reward for burn. The one is adding more volume to the curve, and the other is removing it. So these are basically, this is the core of how it works. If you had, say, a market cap, you limit the maximum supply and price there when you submit it to the curve. And fundamentally, just all you really need. I will mention though that this is designed for using tokens as a backend collateral. If you're using ETH, it's a little different, but not significantly different. So we've encountered several problems in trying to just implement a dynamic price point on ERC. So a lack of floating points makes it very difficult to do things like working back from the curve. So say you wanted to work out how many tokens you could get for a specific amount of DAI rather than the other way around. Not being able to do square roots efficiently is that problem. And because we can't just divide by 0.5, we can't get around not having a square root function either. When you start doing more complex curves, higher order calculations, like having to do a sigmoid function, for example, it gets either computationally complex or very expensive to actually do. One approach, as found in Bancore, which arguably started off all the bonding curve actual development, they have a thing called a connector weight, which is like a mapping where they've actually got all these points along the supply pre-written. So then they inject it so they don't actually have to do those calculations on chain. And there's a lot of other issues, like if you had a mass exodus from your block curve, imagine you have 200 and they want to now all leave. They've given up on your company ICO thing. They want to just buy out of this curve. It then becomes a race for who can get the transaction processed first, and that person then gets sell order. And then it continues until you have the guy who was too slow or didn't put enough gas, and he gets the lowest sell. Now that is a problem. And as we have it's a monthly call for the Curation markets call, and there was a solution to this where you have a sort of batch of sell orders, and then you approximate an average, and then you give all of those orders an average price. They're defined by the bottom line. So if 20 people are selling 20 tokens, you work out the average of that volume and then you share it between them. So, and then you also have a problem with front-running. So if someone's listening out for transactions to see large buy orders, you could then make a transaction that's exactly the same, pump in all the gas you can, buy it before them, and then they need to buy the next round, and then you sell immediately as they get it. So there's a lot of attacks that they're still working around, but one of the more fundamental things is, cool, we have the bonding curve. It's taking in collateral. We now have a stable pool of collateral. What do we do with it? How do we access it? Cool, we have these tokens that represent a bunch of stable coins, but it's just locked up in this contract because they are arbitrary. So that's where that, as referenced earlier, where you split to define a revenue collection service, or alternatively, which is only being explored kind of recently, is actually modifying the shape of the curve. Now, this works better for situations where you have a market cap, but basically, if you had a straight line, now you could reduce the volume of collateral by curving it inwards. Now, that causes it to go from being a linear line to a sort of exponential line. If you think about it like this, I'm making the container for the volume smaller, and thus I can then use all the volume I'm taking out of it. Problem is that now, as you're selling along the curve, the price is not what they expected. It's actually lower than what they expected. So there's a lot of thought being put into how to utilize this collateral. Some situations you're just saying there's a certain period of time that you have to wait until you can buy back along the curve. There's sometimes your tokens are reserved in portions to a specific milestone that's released by an escrow account. There is a lot of flexibility. There just isn't a lot of, it's still quite new. We're still breaking things to see how they can be fixed. So I just want to talk a bit about the community behind the block curves and how we actually got to the point where we're talking about graphs at such a significant point. So Curation markets call, so that happens once a month. There's also the Gitter, which is always quite interesting to see people debating the game theory behind all these curves. The Curation markets call is pretty rad. Ben presented the last one. We have guys like Simon de Riviere. We've got all these people doing quite interesting projects. It was ERC 888, which is a multi-dimensional ERC 20. It was quite fascinating. There's some thought leaders in the space, so like, as I mentioned, Simon. Paul has also written quite extensively on how you would go into designing these curves, how that to play out in markets. And Slava recently published an article on those modifying curves and different attack vectors like that. We also have a project at the moment where it's very difficult to try, as I personally also don't come from a mathematical background. So what we created to try help us understand how these curves might play out and how
Don't listen in this while I'm cooking.
And right, and basically we needed an app that could then help us design the shape. You know, like if at this volume we want this to happen. So we created a bonding curve playground. Ben, I don't know if you can get that open and then we can share from your screen after this.
Cool.
And yeah, so there's a couple of links in here. So the relevant community bonding curves, there's a whole bunch in there. There's exponentials, there's ETH tokens. So that's a place I started when I was trying to learn about these curves. And I can never remember the real name, but yeah, so these are basically the two repos I started from. And yeah, so before we go into statutory topics, these are some questions that we've run in workshops before that are always quite interesting. Like people get very creative with this, and sometimes people just get wrapped up in rabbit holes. It's all in good fun. So what problems could you possibly think of where a bonding curve might be a solution? Could it be changing how Uber works? Could it be deciding how much a utility might cost, say bandwidth or processing power, access to a room in a hospital? There's a lot of ways that you can use the curves as a demand as a sort of mechanism in a system. Or like what kind of collateral is going into this curve? Are people selling ownership to CryptoKitties to then have shares in CryptoKitties? You can. There's a lot of different ways, especially with fungibles, to make this quite complicated. But then, more importantly, what are the attacks? Because it's all good and well having a solution, but you got to figure out how do you get around this? Do you have a group of whales running a cartel to pump up the curve and then give false attention signals to then buy up and sell down? Or what issues don't involve finance that you could apply bonding curves to? It could be curating the value of apps. A good example is Status. Status, the mobile wallet and browser, and that it's a lot of things. But how Status is proposing that they curate their dApps is by this is all a work in progress, so don't quote me on this, but basically, if you publish an app, you could then take amount of stake and say, cool, I'm going to put $10,000 worth of stake. That means that there's 10,000 votes. Now, users can vote up and down, and every time they vote, you get one of your $10,000 back. But now, you've just only given the opportunity for 10,000 votes to happen. That doesn't mean that those votes are going to be positive. And as volume of votes increases, you keep getting the collateral therein returned. So that's not necessarily a full finance, full gaming for profit implementation, but there's also been a lot of commitment curves. So just seeing how people might interact with systems. You could track people being involved in a shard or a side chain and then track the volume going into that chain as a form of commitment curve. So the bonding curves they're somewhat basic, but the problem with it being so basic is that it's hyperdynamic. You can apply it to so many things that it needs a lot of work to actually make it a cohesive system. It is a very new crypto-economic mechanism that we have access to, and yeah, the entire point of all this is to get people thinking, experimenting, playing with bonding curves, and yeah, so I think we'll just kind of show that bonding curve simulator.
Yeah, cool. So the idea behind the bonding curve playground initially was for us to be able to play with bonding curves. So often when we were talking about the bonding curves, the functions that we were using, the design parameters, we would start drawing on paper, and we all developers and should probably be using a tool like MATLAB or something. There was no quick and easy way to create a bonding curve, share it with someone, and play with the design parameters, the effects it would have. So it's a work in progress. It's an open source project. I'll share my screen now to give you an idea of that. Okay, so it's hosted on Netlify, so we don't worry about maintaining the hosting. We'll post the link or send that through to you guys later, I'm sure. And also it's hosted on GitLab, so if any of you want to contribute to the UI, UX, can help us out, that would be great. If you take a basic function like linear curve and you set the token supply to 5,000, plots a very basic curve, and you can see the price and supply at a point along the curve. And eventually you also want to make it into a teaching tool. So you have basic descriptions of what you're looking at, maybe include the curve functions and how these curves are calculated. So this curve, for instance, shows you the collateral versus the implied valuation. So as people buy tokens and put collateral into the collateral pool, you have a valuation that results, and you can see how this would behave. And essentially, this is just the sum of token values underneath this curve, so it's the integral in mathematics. Okay. Cost of buying and selling is also something interesting to look at, because at different points, if you were to buy or sell 10% of the market, you would receive different value back. And yeah, this can be expanded a lot more. You can pretty much put any function you want in, and token supply in the millions. So if you try sigmoid, I think if you use token supply too much bigger than 5,000, it doesn't look right, it's not scaled properly. But this is what a sigmoid looks like. It's quite a nice curve for certain sort of curation market economic models, because it has a nice slow growth in the beginning, becomes steeper, and then it stabilizes as the market matures. So if we increase this to, 5 million. It's about 5 billion with my computer managers. So we've decided to make this all on the front end, no back end processing, just so that it's easier for people to work with code and contribute to the project. So it's all front end JavaScript, some web workers and things to ease the load a little bit. Yeah, it doesn't look right because of the token supply is very large. But if you did the same thing with, say, linear code, it would look more usable. Yeah. And yeah, you can put in your own function as well. Yeah, any function you make, basically.
Cool. But if you guys have any questions or want to, feel free to ask. So we've reached the end of our presentation, and I do hope that it's at least demystifies some aspects of bonding curves. You can always feel free to contact us afterwards, but if you have any questions now, feel free to ask.
Any questions? Anyone?
Should we ask them only near the mic, or should we use the mic?
Well, basically, can you hear me, Ryan? Yeah, okay. So it's better to use the mic from here, but unfortunately you have to come here and ask your question. Yeah.
Hey guys. And yeah, so my question would be about how do you code up your formula in Solidity? So the linear one is easy, but let's take the sinusoidal one, the last one. How do you code this in Solidity? And if you have a more sophisticated formula that has I don't know, exponents and stuff like this, are you able to convert it to something that can be coded in Solidity?
So yeah. So yeah, obviously the first issue that you run into is floating points. We don't have floating points. So the solution to that is scaling. So that would work for basic linear curve, maybe an exponential curve. But as you go into higher order curves, it's a challenge that we're still thinking about. We've thought about using some sort of mapping as a sort of lookup table and having a semi-discrete curve instead of a continuous curve. In that case, these are things we're thinking about. We haven't actually implemented them yet, but you would essentially try and do all the mathematics and calculations before and upload them when you deploy the contract or after you deploy the contract. Otherwise, there are mathematical ways to do approximations, but that becomes inaccurate. So yeah, it's a challenge that we're still grappling with.
What kind of curves do you use?
So we've only really looked at linear and quadratic so far.
How would you choose for yourself?
I guess depends what sort of game theory and market behavior you want to incentivize. Yeah, at the moment we've chosen basic linear curves for Protea because you want slow linear growth. You want a curve that's sort of approachable and understandable to community members. But another thing you could do is have multi-stage bonding curves. You could have a basic linear curve, but then at different periods in the bonding along, if you want to have different stages in the market, you could then create sort of piecewise curves. So it's not really complex mathematics. It's just multiple stages.
Yeah. One last question from me, and I'm not going to take over. Have you guys worked or seen something done with these things called decentralized autonomous trusts, where you actually have two bonding curves inside that are like somewhat parallel to each other, if we can say that, and one is used for selling, one is used for buying. And have you seen like something like this work and how these guys do it?
So, when it comes to having two bonding curves, it's actually, there's a lot of ways to implement it. So, there are examples of sigmoid functions out there, but you could either, if you're, say, taking a contribution on incoming collateral, you basically can like tax it right there. But if you're now making a dynamic sell and buy curve, you basically just have two separate integrals. So you can either code it in there. One approach is having a library dedicated to the specific kind of curve you want. So you just have a pure function that takes in a couple of parameters and then spits out the data your contract might need. You could then actually target a new library if you want for a different curve. They implement the same interface. There's a lot of interesting work when it comes to piecewise functions. So piecewise is another somewhat higher order function for the most part when it comes to trying to code it. But there are some approaches that I would consider a touch risky, especially those. So some people have started looking into using floating point libraries. There's another option of doing more bitwise based math. It's a very old library, but it's a floating point library from BankX that was then forked, and someone else is keeping maintenance on there. But it separates the sign, the exponent, and the mantissa of the floating point into three separate variables. So then you still get some floating point accuracy, but yeah, it's still a sort of evolving nature. Most people who are trying to actually implement this for a business use case aren't dealing with very complex curves as of yet. So that's where things like meme lords comes in quite handy, because now you have a more relaxed use case to actually experiment in more full force. At our present stage, we're dealing mostly with linear curves specifically because we're just getting the first representation of a curve out there. Once we have it set in place, you just plug in a new integral and it just continues as is. The fundamental thing is the contents of the curve integral. So yeah, I've seen a lot of examples. Bancor is by far probably the most complex that I've seen implemented. That their connector weights system is quite interesting, but Bancor is a very it's a very different kind of contract. But yeah, all these resources we can send you and show you all the contracts we've been exploring. Yeah. I hope that at least get a bit of insight with clarity on the topic.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Can you ask where we can find more, like in the resources?
Where can we find more resources?
So I'll send a link to our slides, and if you guys, you're free to join the Curation Markets Gitsa channel. I can also send through there's a Medium post that has a good reading list for bonding curves and Curation Markets. But yeah, all the Medium links that I sent through and some code here and there should be enough to get you started. But I do recommend the monthly call and the Gitsa channel.
Great. Thank you. Any more questions from you guys? No? Okay. Well, I guess that's a wrap up. Thank you, Ryan and Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
For presenting all the way from Africa. Thanks for coming.